Hey everybody, it's Never, and welcome to Storytime with Never. A warning to the parents out here. Today's story is PG-13. Please view and listen to it before showing it with your kids, so that you can be sure that it's appropriate for whatever age they are and whatever sort of rules you set for them. Let's dive right in, shall we? Novalon, Part 3, Raven. Baxter's slow steps had given Novalon cause for concern more and more as the year had progressed. He had been grown up when she was little, and now she was grown up and he was old. She wondered if Baxter would see the next season, and could have cried at the thought. Old Baxter had been with them all of her life. But things grew old and died. The wagon creaked beneath her more noisily than it used to. Father's hair was grayer now, though he said it was just purer blonde, and Mother's hands knitted with more difficulty, though she would never admit it. She reached up and felt the blue scarf around her neck that she had used every winter since she was little. Even Father's axe had needed to be replaced the previous year. Tranquillion's Inn looked lively in the distance, its windows beaming out into the twilight, and the faintest sounds of jovial voices floating to her in the misty air. With so many patrons, they would need extra wood. She would take a good profit. Father would be proud. Perhaps Mother could get a cat. She always said she wanted a cat, but none of them ever made it as far as Silvermoon. "Hey, what are you selling?" a man's voice asked. Nova reined Baxter in and glanced around until she noticed someone standing on the side of the road. It was an elf. Older than her, but not more than a few years. He looked unkempt. Probably a drunk, she thought. Father had taught her how to deal with troublemakers using the axe if she ever needed to. But Kelthalos had always been a safe place if you stayed away from the trolls. "Hey, pretty, I said, what are you selling?" He took hold of the cart and stepped up close to her, giving a whiff of foul-smelling breath. "Wood. I'm a woodsman. I sell wood." "I've got some wood here for you. How about we trade?" Nova turned away in disgust, and raised her hands to give Baxter's reins a snap. All in a frozen instant, Nova realized how much trouble she was in. Just as his hands flew toward her, she slid across the bench and hopped off the other side of the wagon. Baxter neighed and took a few steps backward. Nova reached into the back of the wagon for the axe, but the foul man was too quick and caught hold of her hand. He jumped down from the wagon, nearly crushing her wrist in his grip. Nova's heart was pounding in her ears, so loud she could barely hear the roar of merriment from the inn. Her knees felt weak as he yanked at her arm, pulling her backwards into his embrace. His hand found her mouth before she could think to scream. Her breaths were fast and shallow, and a sense of terror trembled inside her. Frantically, she put her elbow into his ribs and he recoiled. She broke free and made for a run, but he caught her arm again and pulled back, this time sticking a rusty dagger into her thigh. She screamed into the dingy palm of his glove, and realized with overwhelming horror that no one could hear her. The wound the knife had made was searing every time she moved. He took her step by step, desperately resisted step, into the deep woods until they came to a clearing. He let go of her mouth, and she tried to scream for help, but her voice was so weak with fear she could barely hear it herself. The man laughed as Nova felt her shirt rip down the front and fall off of her shoulders. She struggled anew against him, which only made her more fully aware of how vulnerable she was. She felt his fingers unlatching her belt, while his other arm coiled around her arm and neck. He was so much stronger than she was. She flailed about, trying to do anything to stop him or to get away, but she felt her trousers fall to her knees, and hope go out of her as she was forced down onto her back. The damp earth pressed cold against her skin, but she gritted her teeth, staring up at the pale night sky. She could feel his weight upon her, his palms digging into her wrists as he held her in place. The wound in her leg throbbed so hard that she could no longer discern the sensation of blood trickling down her thigh. A raven passed overhead, and she sang in a choked whisper to herself, "Raven above, where do you come from? Raven on high, dark against the sky. Raven, so wise is the truth in your eyes. Raven, oh Raven, do you see me cry?" As his grunts became louder, she raised her voice, desperately trying to drown them. She wished the raven would save her, would peck the man's eyes out, but it only flew on. "Raven above, where do you come from? Raven on—" She cried out as he slapped her face. "You sing another word, and I'll have you after I kill you." He put his fist into her ribs hard, and she felt the air go out of her. Seizing the moment, she groped at the ground with her free hand until her fingers closed around a fist-sized rock. With a howl of exertion, she brought the rock up the side of his head with a sickening crunch. He fell to the side of her, and she struggled to her knees, wiping tears from her eyes with soiled forearms, smearing sand and dirt across her face. Vengeance deeper than she had ever imagined possible exploded within her. She grasped the rock with both hands and brought it down on his head, his face, his neck, anywhere she could strike, again and again and again, until her strength faltered, and the man wheezed labored, bloody breaths. Nova held the rock high for another strike, shaking until she heard it thud to the ground, and she doubled over, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She stayed there for a long time, hugging herself, unable to move, her sweat stinging cold in the night air. When her wits returned to her, her eyes found her trembling hands. A grotesque arrangement of blood, dirt, and sweat covered them. But it was as if they belonged to someone else, and she clung to the notion, untrue as it may be. She could not face the horror of what her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the man's breathing, still feeble and broken. Mercy, he managed. Time seemed to stand still. In that endless moment, Nova tried to comprehend the concept of mercy. She tried to see how mercy could possibly apply to this man, or to her. Mercy, the very notion of it was so impossible, so forever and completely void that she nearly laughed aloud. Hatred fused with suffering, and the two of them whirled around in guilt, and finally the three collided with amusement and became a madness within her. Emotions faded away, hiding in the darkest corners of her mind. She got to her feet and replaced her clothing, ignoring the rips and stains. She looked down at the man at her feet, his back still quivering with weak breaths. She calmly stepped over him and knelt, straddling his back. She bent forward toward his head, and the madness swam her soul. She slid her hands forward under his chin and pried his head backward. He struggled beneath her, kicking his feet and spitting droplets of blood, but she only pulled harder. Tears spilled from the man's eyes as she brought his head back far enough to see his face. She loomed over him, her face expressionless as he whimpered in agony. He met her eyes, and she looked deep within him. Then the madness within her blazed with life, a fire fueled by darkest hatred and stirred by red revenge. With all her strength, she screamed and pulled backward on his head, digging her fingers into his flesh until there was a disturbing crack, and the man's neck gave way. Nova released him, and his head fell forward at an unsettling angle. She stood and looked down at her work, and then at her hands again. She held them out in front of her, and closed and opened her fists. Then the world spun around her, and the ground came up to strike her face. She felt her body relax. She was so cold, so tired. Then she saw her leg and realized how severe the wound was. Her blood was pooling beneath her, and as the world around her darkened, she heard the clanking armor and the rattling of bony footsteps. In the last glimpse of life she saw, to her terror, a numberless army marching toward her. An army of the dead. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Storytime with Never, featuring part 3 of the Novalon story. So, if you like the story and you'd like to see more of Novalon or of Bleat, stick around, subscribe to the channel, there is more to come. I've had these stories waiting for quite a while to release them to everybody, and hope that you enjoy them. There's a good deal more chapters that I'm sitting on, waiting for time to release. But if I just do stories all the time, I'd probably get bored of it, so we have to space them out. Anyway, thanks for watching. Tell your friends about me, and get ready for Warlords of Draenor. Okay, thanks, bye! Moose Blingtron!